Welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. This episode is about Canada and its inch by inch, foot by foot, maybe mile by mile creep toward a social credit system where there are divisions of classes based on your beliefs, and we're going to find out what you might do. If you've seen the movie by Steven Spielberg with Tom Cruise called The Minority Report, where they find people that they think are going to, based on data, are going to commit a crime. That's what the new Bill C-36 is about in Canada, where you can actually take someone to court. And a citizen can take someone to court because of what you might do. Think about what that does in helping to build, quite frankly, this is not hyperbole, a police state where every citizen becomes a policeman or policewoman watching over the shoulder of their neighbors. Now, before we go into Bill C-36, which is being reintroduced from last summer with a few amendments that it wants to make to the Emergencies Act, we need to talk about how it got here and why it's being pushed again in the House of Commons in Canada. The Emergencies Act was initiated by Trudeau for the first time since it was ever introduced back in 1988. The Emergency Act, though it has been removed earlier this week, put into place basically martial law, where those who did not behave appropriately, or as Trudeau put it, had unacceptable views, were deplatformed, they were debanked, and they were eventually denied access to the modern economy completely because of, well, as punishment to their unacceptable views. Think about the message that this puts across. That's exactly what it was. I doubt that Trudeau planned on keeping this Emergencies Act in place for a long period of time, but think of the precedent that this puts in place for what the government can do in the future. And more than that, it's the message to people who want to assemble to protest, that are on the right, obviously, not on the left, that if you do these things, you run the risk of having all of your assets, your bank accounts, your credit cards frozen, and you are going to be deplatformed from social media. What this did was say that if you attend an event and it is deemed unlawful by the government under the Emergencies Act because of unacceptable views, then that is now illegal. The right to assemble and protest, if it's under unacceptable views, is now illegal. So what that moves us toward is saying, well, whose views are acceptable and whose are not acceptable? This is the primary reason for the First Amendment in the United States that is being slowly carved away. Free speech is now on the docket in little pieces to be decapitated and held up only for those that have acceptable views. The whole purpose of the First Amendment is so that those that you disagree with have the ability to debate, to speak. Because the truth is, at some point, it's going to turn around and it's going to get to you, where though you might be with those that have acceptable views today, tomorrow you may not have acceptable views as the line moves with the culture. So a week and a half ago, Trudeau puts the Emergencies Act into place. This was unused since its inception in 1988. It gives government virtually unlimited power for 30 days to deal with a crisis. So the protest was a crisis. Yes, there were issues with trade, But think about what happened with Black Lives Matter, all of the looting and the burning down of buildings in the United States anyway, the bludgeoning of individuals. There was some murder that happened. I mean, there was mass chaos. There was complete takeovers of city blocks in places like Portland. But no, for this, there is going to be an Emergencies Act that is going to be put into place because of unacceptable views. If you think for a moment this was just about the trade route, and there's some legitimacy to that, right? There is. But if you think that's really what it was all about, I want you to put things on the other foot and say, well, what if this was a Black Lives Matter event and they were at the border and they were stopping trade and there were thousands and thousands of individuals there blocking the roadways? What do you think would have happened? Do you think that the Emergencies Act would have been put into play? I think you can be very skeptical of that. Later, Trudeau invokes a new directive called the Emergency Economic Measures Order. This invokes really a laws that were built for the war on terror. And this is where things are moving. I'm going to do something on the U.S. here shortly that is very, very concerning on how the creeping forward of the war on terror globally is coming to the United States domestically, similar to what is happening here in Canada. There are changes in the last few months in the U.S. that should open your eyes quite a bit and that you need to be aware of. But this war on terror law is called the Proceeds of Crime and Terrorist Financing Act. So in essence, they end up calling the truckers in the convoy domestic terrorists. This act requires financial institutions, including banks, credit unions, co-ops, loan companies, trusts, and even cryptocurrency wallets, to stop providing any financial or related services. So something built for terrorists, like where there could be real violence and so that we can protect individuals, is now being used on citizens that are protesting a mandate on COVID. And so this is kind of like, you've heard of crony capitalism, right? This is the crony Red Guard system. This is the crony Minority Report system, where you have institutions that are, instead of the government, they pawn this off onto the institutions, the private institutions, and make them liable and responsible to find those individuals that are assembling in protest with unacceptable views that can be deemed domestic terrorists. So if they're liable to this to the government, how far do the institutions take it? What about the banks? Are they going to start searching social media for everyone that is a depositor at a bank that has a checking account? What about loans that they have from those banks? Are they going to be called due? Do they have to stop any transactions with a mortgage or a car loan? They're told that they must stop providing any financial or related services, basically to anyone that is involved in this specific example, in this convoy protest. So obviously these institutions are going to lean toward caution for their own institution, for their own interests, and not for the interests of those that are patrons of that bank. Now, according to the CBC, this has resulted in numerous frozen accounts, stranded money, and canceled credit cards. According to this new order, banks have a duty to determine, in quotes, duty to determine if one of their customers is a designated person. Now, what is a designated person? A designated person can refer to anyone, right, who directly or indirectly, that's in quotes, participates in the protest. So if you are giving money to the trucker convoy, or in the future, any other protest with unacceptable views, then you can be removed from the banking system. Your credit cards can be canceled according to the words in these acts. If you provide property, even food, if you gave money through a crowdfunding site like GoFundMe, under the Emergencies Act and the other acts that have been invoked here, you are liable and apparently committing a crime without probably even knowing it. And this expands even further. You have the Justice Minister in Canada, David Lametti. He goes on Canadian television and says that anyone contributing to a pro-Trump movement, what does that mean? Anyone contributing money to a pro-Trump movement should be worried. That's what he said, worried about their bank accounts and other financial assets being frozen. Think about what this means. This is, to some degree, depending on the party in power, this is like one party rule. So what you end up with is financial institutions like banks. I mean, how far do they take that out? How do they know when someone was involved with a protest? How do they know if somehow someone supported a protest of unacceptable views? You have to play like kind of a 6 degrees game here to figure that out. And how far do you take it? So what this does is it creates a caste system of social credit based on your political views. And it's not just under the Emergencies Act. That's the point here that I'm trying to make when we look at Bill C-36 that is being reintroduced. They are trying to make these things more permanent. So it's not just this little period of time there where this was in place for a little over a week, but they're taking this and marching forward with it to give the state more and more and more power. This is all about the rise of authoritarianism. And it's not just Canada. Look at the way things have been treated under COVID in Australia. Look at the rise of Russia here with Ukraine. Look at the rise of China and what they did with Hong Kong and the threats now against Taiwan. Look at what is happening, we'll show you shortly, in the U.S. in terms of this new umbrella of domestic terrorism. And most of this is done, and moving forward in Canada, and here too in the United States, most of this is done under the idea of diversity and tolerance, right? And so we end up going into diversity and tolerance, and you end up doing the exact opposite of diversity and tolerance. What it really means with diversity, equity, and inclusion or tolerance in these things is that there's a certain view that is acceptable and everything else is an unacceptable view. That's what DEI really means. And in this type of a social credit system where you have this crony police state with the institutions, the government can be more confident that they don't have to be the ones initiating this. So it looks better for the government, but we can actually have the institutions in a Western democracy be the filters, be the red guard, be those that are turning and watching their own customers to make sure that their views are acceptable, that they don't have wrong speak. And by the way, this is a lot of the way China works. You know, you think of this authoritarian government, it is an authoritarian government, but they turn everything downward from them so that in society, you have people looking over everybody's shoulder, keeping people in place. This is not a good development. The other thing this Emergencies Act does is it requires private companies, again, make the private companies do this, to follow suit in bringing down the protests, right? And as an example, the tow truck companies were required by the government to go out and tow the semi-trucks away. They were compelled to do it. That doesn't seem a lot like a free Western democracy. And you consider some of the things that Trudeau has said in the past that go right along with what he's doing here. Here's what he said. He said that he admires communist China. He said this when he was the head of the Labor Department, or the Labor Party in Canada. Right? Here's a quote from him. He said, "There is a level of admiration I actually have for China because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn the economy around on a dime and say we need to go green." So if they have values of green values, man, if you can have a dictatorship so that you can make it happen, so that your acceptable views can be implemented, then this is a great thing to Trudeau. He says we need to start, investing in solar. He says, in reference to the position of the prime minister, he says there's a flexibility, or the power is what he means, of the office of the prime minister that one must dream about, having a dictatorship where you can do whatever you wanted, that I find quite interesting. Well, I find that quote quite interesting from Trudeau. And looking at him now, many years later, in this position of the prime minister, desiring, wanting, using that flexibility toward works of a dictator to make sure that his acceptable views are implemented and that the unacceptable views are removed. Now, getting to Bill C-36 here that is being put out for the government and proposed, the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, said the following: "We used all the tools that we had prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, and we determined we needed some additional tools." So as finance prime minister or finance minister, she's overlooking the things such as the freezing the accounts and the credit card cancellations, etc. But then she said this also: "Some of those tools we will be putting forward measures to put those measures," not great English here, "to put those measures permanently in place." Permanently in place. In other words, drawing on the idea of domestic terrorism and hate speech. We will have this ability to freeze accounts, cancel credit cards, remove you from the modern economy if you have unacceptable views. And this is exactly what they are moving toward. Here's what the Canadian Civil Liberties Association said about using this Emergencies Act. Even though the orders are no longer in force right after Trudeau removed them, Canadians are left with the precedent that the government's actions have set. And this is exactly right. It's not just a precedent for future legislation like Bill C-36, but it's a precedent of the social credit system. People are going to be more afraid of protesting and assembling. It's an attack on free speech. Now, with Bill C-36, this is introduced by the diversity minister, Ahmed Hussein. Right? Of course, this is under diversity. This is, and see, you've got to see what these things are really couched in. What is really driving this? This doesn't come from the Minister of Finance even. This doesn't come from whoever's over trade and or transportation, right? This comes under the umbrella of diversity. And so when you think about the term diversity, you need to understand how this encroaches on all things and what diversity, equity, and inclusion really means. Now, some people can manage that a little bit differently, and some do. Some companies do. I know there are individuals at Brigham Young University that are in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion that try to take a different approach to this. But overall in the academy, where this really grew out of, where you have diversity, equity, and inclusion, it eventually reaches its tentacles out into all of the departments and into all things. Race and diversity and equity must be the primary value for all people. That's ultimately what it makes itself, right? It wants all of the power to be under these values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they're not good values. Don't be duped by the names. This is a perfect example of this, where you're trying to put this under diversity here with the diversity minister. He reintroduces Bill C-36, which was introduced originally back in the summer of 2021. Bill C-36 has some very, very disturbing verbiage. And basically, when we talk about the idea of the minority report, where you can be brought to court before there's even a crime by your neighbor or your family member, that's what this is. Here's the exact verbiage of the Bill C-36. This is section 810.012.1. I quote, "A person may, with the Attorney General's consent, lay an information before a provincial court judge if the person fears on reasonable grounds," what does that mean? "that another person will commit an offense under section 318 or subsection 319.1 or 2. This has all to do with hate speech. An offense under subsection 434.1, or an offense motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on race, national or ethnic origin, language, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or any other similar factor." Look, those are horrible things. Nobody wants people to be offending others. But in a world of a First Amendment, in a world of free speech, you have to allow for offense. Being offended is not the top value. We all need to be offended sometimes. If you're going to have debate and go through issues and talk about what the best course for the future is, there's always going to be offense. And this says not only is the offense bad and perhaps illegal, but if your neighbor or your family member thinks that you might offend with what you plan on doing or saying or whatever it might be, then they can take you to the court. They can have they can submit this to the court, and at the court, right, you can be you're not going to be put into jail, but you're going to be put under surveillance if the court deems that this is possible, that you might commit a problem. You're going to be put under surveillance for 12 months. If you're a repeat offender, for 24 months. And this includes things like having an electronic monitor on you that you cannot remove. A tweet put out by a Lulu Chang Maservi puts this into perspective and kind of summarizes this bill pretty well. She says the Canadian government has proposed legislation, Bill C-36, where people can be taken to court and penalized if they're suspected of being about to post something hateful online. Imagine. In Nazi Germany, a police state, you had up to 1/3 of all kids in families spying for the Nazi Party, watching over their parents. This is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union, and this is what happens in China. This is what happens in North Korea. You end up with a self-policing state by the citizens because they gain social credit if they turn someone in. She says an individual would be able to report another preemptively for something they haven't said yet, right? This is, again, like the minority report. Alarming aspects in ascending order, she says. Number one, fuzzy and circular definition of hateful speech. Involves detestation stronger than dislike. Look, this is the whole issue here. What is hate speech? And there are more and more precedents that can be set for this. The trucker convoy was determined as hate speech. And of course, they try and put this weight around all of the truckers because there were a few out of thousands of truckers and protesters. There were a few Confederate flags and I think one Nazi flag from some idiots that were there at the convoy. But of course, Trudeau irresponsibly puts this as, okay, these are a bunch of racists and hate-filled, hate speech protesters. Why? Because they need to put it under that umbrella. This is setting more precedent for Bill C-36 and other legislation that is coming down the pike in Canada about symbols and other things like that. What is hate speech? Number 2, encouraging citizens to report on one another. This is... And number 3, the ability to punish people for something they haven't actually done yet. Right? This is very concerning. And it is a reality, right? It is what we are moving toward. This is something that globally is happening in Western society. The whole ideology under critical social justice and critical race theory moves toward tyranny, just like hard right ideologies do the same. And this is why I always say you've got to separate the compassion, which is really where they try to bring you in. Ultimately, it's not really about compassion. And then the politics and the radical leftism underneath these movements and these ideologies of CRT and critical social justice. They're not what you think they are. This is being introduced under the diversity minister in Canada. Keep that in mind.